In 21st century America, the only thing we know in living memory is the public school system, very close to how it exists today. You have school districts all across the country. There's state oversight of the districts. There's the Federal Department of Education that's been around since the 1970s. The public schooling model was pretty much universally adopted by the early 20th century. Your parents went to it, your grandparents went to it. It's likely that your great-grandparents went through it. Like, nobody remembers going to a one-room schoolhouse anymore, being locally educated. If you do that, you're weird. Like, and that's how every generation that is still alive thinks about it. So it feels like this very status quo thing. Like, this is just how it is.
This is the way you learn.
Yeah, it's the way you don't learn. I'm not just going to throw around bold, juicy statements. I'm actually going to back all of this up. For the majority of human history, that is not how we learned. For the majority of human history, we didn't have recorded history as we know it now. And children learned and grew up and became functioning members of their tribe or their society just fine. And then over the course of more modern history, most people were educated on a local level. There never was a national institution of education. And then in the mid 19th century, America was expanding very quickly. Mm-hmm. It had a very large influx of immigrants who came from very disparate cultures, very disparate places. Everybody homogenizing nicely was not necessarily organically happening as quickly as people wanted, particularly in the Northeast and particularly in Massachusetts. There were concerns about how well all of these incoming immigrants were going to integrate into American society. And so the first stab at designing a more centralized education system was embarked upon. And by the early 20th century, it was put into place across the country. The system was designed with, it was designed to be a system. It was designed to be as cohesive and as consistent as possible. And so it was also designed to educate kids at scale.
At one level, that makes a lot of sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a lot of kids coming into the society.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, well, we got that happening right now. We got a lot of immigration in the country. And you want there to be a culture that's mm-hmm. a thing, right? So how are you going to do that and have some notion that a minimum standard is being delivered, right? Isn't that... Seems fair. Seems like reasonable goals.
It sounds very humanitarian, honestly. You're going to educate children who wouldn't necessarily have access or resources to education. Otherwise, you're going to mandate that it is paid for by the government. So even if your family doesn't have any resources to put towards education, your child will still get they'll have an equal opportunity to education. It sounds very noble. In practice, it works very poorly. There were a couple sort of prerogatives of the way the system was set up in the first place. One is that it had to be scalable. So you had to have a fairly substantial number of kids in a classroom, like pretty high student to teacher ratio, because you need to be able to staff a school and educate kids at scale. And so you have 20 to 30 kids in a classroom. You're dividing them by grade level so that the teacher can focus on instructing everybody in the class at the same time. But children do not all learn at the exact same pace. You don't come with factory settings. It's like, okay, on day 183 of being a 7-year-old, you're going to be ready to, learn how to divide something. Like, it doesn't work that way. And so the needs of the children inside the classroom are never being universally met. It was also designed to be sort of a bridge between childhood and the rapidly industrializing world. So it was intended to train kids for gainful employment and integrate all of these children of immigrants into being useful members of the adult workforce. And so it was not intended to cultivate curiosity, creativity, any of the virtues that we really appreciate in innovative and industrious people. Those things aren't useful. And so none of those were put in the equation at all.
I've been going back and reading John Taylor Gatto's Weapons of Mass Instruction.
Fantastic book.
There seems like there's two threads, as he lays out. and I'd love for you to expand on this from all your work, which is you have this sort of this Prussian system established under Otto von Bismarck that is very much a produce willing cannon fodder and loyal Prussian citizens as its North Star. Mm-hmm. Pledge allegiance to the flag, Nazi-style salutes, and all that kind of stuff. Then you also have, I think, the Rockefellers and other players in American industrial society, which is very particular to the time of the beginning of the assembly line, which we aren't living in anymore, actually. But there's this sense that, like, oh, how are we going to have people get into these almost widget-like jobs? Let's turn them into widgets. And that's seen and talked about quite explicitly. Like, let's knock off the edges here. And the third piece of the puzzle, as I understand it, is this is the dawn of the progressive era. And so you have this, like, early trust the science, eugenics. We know how to create the perfect man. You look at like the art at the time and like the World Fair, and it's all got this sort of kind of optimistic futurism that also is like a kind of creepy totalitarian worldview at the same time. Is that how you see this mix going on? Like, how do you understand the different forces at work at the birth of public education in the U.S.?
So Horace Mann, who's the granddaddy of education in America as we know it, was responsible for the inception of the public education system in Massachusetts, which is where the forefront of public education across America was established. He went to Prussia to study the Prussian education model, which, as you said, it was intended to build a cohesive society where everyone was a good Prussian citizen and would be a willing member of the military. Its ideal graduate was someone who didn't think too hard for themselves, because if they did, they might say, well, why am I going to fight in this war, and why am I going to be cannon fodder? That doesn't sound like a good life. What if I want to be a farmer or a writer or a poet? Those types of divergent thinkings are not helpful to a system. A system always cares about the sustaining of said system. That's its number one priority. So if you're causing problems for the system, not good. And so that was very explicitly lauded as the gold standard of what education ought to be. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, how we should educate our children was actually like a very popular thing to discuss. It was like a very common conversation topic, much more than it is today. Like, it was fashionable to have an opinion about it. And so people were actively thinking about this. And it was much more part of the cultural milieu. Now we just kind of assume, well, the Department of Education exists and this is how we've always done it, even though that's not true. The average person doesn't have strong opinions about which modality of education is the best and which pedagogical approach is superior. Should we teach kids through the Socratic method? Should we teach them with a teacher in front of the classroom lecturing, or should we use AI-driven apps that can, help each kid learn at exactly their pace? Should we have kids with a teacher in front of the classroom at all, or should we have them doing independent work cycles like in Montessori classrooms where, 4 and 5-year-olds are working all by themselves without any adult intervention? Like, nobody had opinions on these things, or nobody has them now, or very few people do. It's kind of like a weird fringe area of interest. But at the time, people had opinions about it. But there was this sense of like we were building towards a rapidly industrializing world, so you had to be effective at being on the assembly line or working a rapidly industrializing job in order to fit into the emerging economy. So I think you're right. The forces were very, very explicitly pulling strings within the development of the education system. And when you go back and read the literature, it's very explicitly there. No one was hiding it.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.